we saw a lot of memes that said we should not go back to normal. And I meant that because, one, again, normal wasn't working for us. It never has been. The whole entire US system has never worked for us. It wasn't created for us.
Produced on the traditional territories of the Tewa people, the Santa Fe Art Institute welcomes you back to the Tilt Podcast. The ongoing pandemic has disrupted the rhythms of everyday life, prompting us to reconfigure how we connect, communicate, and work together. On today's episode, hear from community-driven organizations, the New Mexico Asian Family Center and the Pueblo Action Alliance, about some of their creative strategies for addressing shifting community needs and how they've continued to build partnerships, host events, and show up for others during times of isolation. Tony Netsapun and I are pleased to present to you Episode 7, Cultivating Community.
Hi, Sachi. Welcome
Hi.
to the SFAI Tilt Podcast. For our listeners who may not be familiar with the New Mexico Asian Family Center, can you tell us about the work that you do briefly and briefly describe the communities that you serve?
Absolutely. The New Mexico Asian Family Center is a social service agency primarily for the Asian population in New Mexico. And our mission is to provide culturally sensitive programs and services, creating a Pan-Asian community that advocates for and supports itself. And so we have two main sections of our organization, and one is our direct service team, and we have case management and legal support, and counseling services and peer support groups and healing circles. And then on the other side, we have programs like civic engagement work and youth programming, family programming, financial education workshops, and just kind of what the community is looking for. We work to create those programs for them, including like interpretation and translation services as well. So, and the populations we serve are mostly newcomers to the country, a lot of foreign-born Asian folks. Our biggest client base is from Vietnam and the Philippines and Afghanistan and China and Taiwan. So we have a lot of different clients from lots of different places, and mostly they come to us through word of mouth.
Just reflecting this past year or year and a half or so, which has been super duper rough for all of us, nonprofits, individuals on a personal level. How did the New Mexico Asian Family Center respond to in your programs and services that you listed, that you offered? Were there any shift in focus, any new strategies or approaches that your organization undertook to address these changing needs?
Yeah, so we have been an organization that primarily serves clients who are facing situations of domestic violence and sexual violence in the past, and we get a lot of funding to support those services. And we also do navigation and resource services for folks as well, but that was always something we had a harder time finding funding for. But as the pandemic hit, it was so clear that we just had to provide the services regardless of if we found the funding or not. And so luckily we did get extra support to be able to provide those services, but so much of the pandemic was really ensuring that we were making that clients were getting their basic needs met. We did a lot of rental assistance and utility assistance and mortgage assistance and housing support and food boxes and the connections to that stuff and those resources. And so that was a big, and of course benefits as well. We also really wanted them to have access to the unemployment benefits and social security benefits and SNAP benefits and things like that were harder for them to access. And so we did have so many more resource clients, as we call them. And we had to just kind of find the money in our budget wherever we could to do that work. And we also would say that we had an overall increase in our domestic violence and divorce cases, and our attorneys were way busier than usual because our attorneys are family law attorneys, and usually they, their caseloads and their schedules were just so much busier. And so that was kind of a sign to us that the cases had increased quite a bit.
I was reading your website, and there's a lot of preventative wellness initiatives in place within the New Mexico Asian Family Center, such as the family programs, the intergeneration family service activities. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that played out during the COVID pandemic in times of where care is much in need?
Yeah, absolutely. So the organization was really started as a direct service organization, and for a couple of years back in 2006, and for a couple of years that service was really critical and crucial, and we were realizing that not only were we providing these services, but that these people needed prevention services or community-based responses to some of the issues that were coming up, and they were so prevalent in the community that we recognized the need to kind of do the other side of the work, which is the prevention and education and support networking. And so we started building out the programs and what we call the community engagement side of our organization. And we really listened to the women and families who were impacted and people who had actually gone through our services to create those programs. And they've changed over time because, every so often, we learn something new from our clients. Like we learn that they really need something like for a while we only had one-on-one counseling, talk therapy, or family therapy. But for a lot of folks, it just didn't feel culturally specific for their needs and just wasn't quite what they wanted, and didn't feel comfortable, or it was taboo in their culture to have talk therapy. And so they asked for peer support groups, and that was something that we created and now have multiple in-language peer support groups for our clients. And those have been really powerful for people to gain that support and from each other and build that trust and talk about topics like self-care and like mental health and consent and boundaries that they didn't necessarily have space to talk about before. And then for the family programming, we did actually create a whole new position during the pandemic. We have a family coordinator now, and she works with the families, around 200 families, to support them in accessing in connecting with APS and accessing resources like Chromebooks and learning how to use Google Classroom and connecting them to early childhood education programs and home visitation programs. And she really supports with navigation resources for the families who are needing support with young children. So that was something that was a huge need, clearly. And those programs and services are increasingly expanding as we speak.
What is something folks may not know or understand about the Asian American Pacific Islander experience during the pandemic? Particularly that may not be broadcast in the media or addressed on a national or state or local level?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because I think that is something that we think about a lot as well, in how the media responds and just when and how people start paying attention to these things. And I think one thing that is starting to become more well known is that these issues aren't new. And I think for a while, many people were just learning about, hate crimes towards Asians, and that, yes, there is some sort of increase and rise in the past year or so, but those situations and that kind of bigotry and racism has existed far before the pandemic. And I think that's something that people forget. And that's one thing. And then the other thing I would say is language access. That is one thing that people don't talk about very much. And that is our biggest focus probably in our organization, because so many of our clients, I think about 84% of our clients receive services in a language other than English. And it's so critical because it's so much harder for them to access benefits through through the Department of Workforce Solutions or through the Social Security Office. They're having a really hard time getting access to those benefits without having language access or somebody to help them walk through the process and interpret for them or translate documents. And that has just been so challenging, and it's already a challenging process for anyone. And then adding a language barrier and a cultural barrier to that is just so difficult. And especially with the Asian population here in New Mexico, those languages are not translated in a lot of cases. Mostly it's in Spanish and then maybe Vietnamese, but all the other languages, there's hundreds of Asian languages, and there's hundreds of Asian languages represented here in New Mexico and in Albuquerque. And so those folks don't have a way to get access to these things if they don't speak English or another Asian language that is available. And so while we don't have every language on staff, obviously, we do have also our interpretation service and phone line, so we can help them. Whoever it is who is able to come to us and needs support, we can do that. And I think that is a really critical part of this whole experience. And we also really want to cherish and support and amplify and uplift these languages and these experiences, because they are people's histories and cultures. And I think there's such a power in people being able to access their resources in their own language. And that is empowering, and it is what everyone deserves. And so that's something that is so huge for us, and we're always fighting for. And unfortunately, we tried to get a bill passed this last legislative session for language access across the state, language access plans across the state. But it didn't have enough time to get through. So we're still pushing, and it's been under the way for years. So we're really trying to keep that going. But yeah, that's been one of the biggest things that we're always thinking about and hearing from our clients.
Maybe you can walk us through from the ground up, I mean, in terms of your organization's response to this past year and a half of increasing xenophobic rhetoric towards the Asia Pacific Islander community. What are some of the grassroots initiatives, actions that New Mexico Asian Family Center have undertook?
I think what we focused on was just making sure that first and foremost, our staff were safe and comfortable, because if they are not, then we aren't able to be there for the community. And then secondly, if the communities and the people we're working with feel safe and comfortable. And we didn't make any big changes or any big programming specifically around that, because it's also been the work that we've been doing forever. We've been having hate crimes come to us since the beginning of our organization started. And so I think it's something we're familiar with, and we just really try to believe and listen and hear what people are saying and find whatever resources they need to feel re-empowered and safe in their communities. And so if that means filing a police report, then that's what we'll help them do. If that means just talking through it, then that's what we'll support them to do. If that means going to a peer support group, then we'll support them in that as well. And so I think it's really putting the client first and doing this very individualized approach to supporting folks who have experienced these things, and also sharing that with our community and having people talk about it within their own communities and their own cultural context, because we don't want to freak people out, and we don't want to make them feel more afraid And we also want them to have the resources to keep themselves safe and be informed. And so it's a balance between those two responses and ways of communicating. And so we really try to keep all the information transparent and honest as much as we can from the media and news and whatever we're learning, and not scare people so that they aren't able to go about their daily lives on their own. And so I think it's been a balancing act forever, and it didn't really change when the pandemic hit. It just increased. We just had to do more of that and more. We had to spend more time thinking about those cases as people were coming forward with them. But since the pandemic, we haven't had more really specific cases than usual, I would say, about hate crimes, because I think they come and go as they come and go. And it's hard to say if that's because of any particular reason, but it is also possible that a lot of the people who were coming to us were just so desperate for support with basic needs and resources that was the priority, and whatever they were experiencing in other ways couldn't necessarily be put at the forefront of what they're asking for support from us, because they needed to be in a house, they needed to be able to pay their water bill or something like that. So it's hard to say, but I think we kept going, and we really prioritize protecting the staff as well.
What can other people who's outside of this community, the Asia Pacific Islander community, what can they do? Any suggestions you may have?
Yeah, I mean, what I usually say is supporting language access, because that's one of the biggest things that we see as an issue. And especially when people are trying to, for example, get a license at the MVD, or trying to even send a package at FedEx or something like that, and people just being really disrespectful to them because of their language barrier. That's something that somebody can easily step in and support with if it's not escalated and if it's safe to do so. And I think also supporting language access on a broader scale and policy levels, and getting informed about the work that is going on around language access is really crucial. I think also just educating yourself on the history of anti-Asian violence and xenophobia, and educating your peers on that. I think also, understanding how to be a bystander in a safe way and what to do when you're in that situation, and doing some research on safe ways to respond. And then, I guess I also really believe in supporting community-based solutions that don't call for more policing, because that is clearly negatively impacts so many communities across the state, and it's not a solution at all to what's going on. And also doesn't, in our own experience as well, it doesn't help at all with our clients. More policing does not do anything for the safety of most of our clients. And so we really don't support those approaches to safety in the community.
Just imagine this Tilt podcast being a digital megaphone in a way. Please tell us about some forthcoming projects that excites you and gives you a sense of hope.
Yeah. One of our projects that it's kind of a multiple step project, and we're in the final stage of it, is called True New Mexico. True New Mexico, a collection of self-portraits from young Black and Asian American Pacific Islander New Mexicans looking to discuss and dismantle the tricultural myth. So we supported 10 young artists from the age of 13 to 24, and helped them and did workshops with them and gave them funding to create art projects, self-portrait art projects in whatever medium they wanted to express their experience of being Black or Asian or both in New Mexico, and what that felt like. And so they worked on their art for 3 weeks, and then they had a virtual presentation where they discussed their experiences and presented their work. And then we had a pop-up at the Art Walk, the First Friday Art Walk downtown last month. And then this coming summer, I think, or this summer, sometime July or August, we're going to have a gallery showing of all of their work as well. So we're really excited about that and that collaboration with the New Mexico Black Leadership Council and the work that they've been doing. And it's been really empowering for the youth to create that community and have that expression of self seen in a way that it's not usually seen in New Mexico. And so we are really excited about that, and also just more investment in the youth. We have had youth coordinators and youth programming, specified youth programming in the past. And I think right now we don't have a youth coordinator, but I'm really hoping to hire one soon and really support more youth and across the state, because that's something that I'm really passionate about and I'm really excited about. And a lot of our clients are from the older generation, and we support them. We support a lot of parents. We support small children through their parents, but we don't really have a lot of programming for that age group. Teenagers and middle schoolers and teenagers and early college years. So we really wanted to focus on that a little bit. So that's what we're excited about. I'm really excited about, from that administrative point of view, is really building out some systems in the organization that support sustainability, self-care, and prioritizing folks' mental health. And so I think our organization already does a pretty good job of that, because we all do know intuitively that to provide these resources, we need to be taking care of ourselves, but it is so hard to actually act on that. And if the systems and structures aren't in place, it's really easy to just keep doing it, even if you feel like you can't, because we really want to, and we really care. And our staff is so compassionate and generous with their time and energy, and they're in this work because of that. And so it's a really fine balancing act of making sure that those people who are just so willing to love and support and care for their communities to no end, that they do have some sort of boundaries for themselves, and how we can create a culture of supporting ourselves and having built capacity within the organization, so that is truly possible, and there isn't a feeling of guilt or like there's too much to do. And so that's something that I am really working on. And there's no right answer. I don't think I know what to do necessarily, but I think we're all working towards that, and just kind of building a new culture into this nonprofit sector. And that's also going to take probably generations, but there is a lot of issues with how the nonprofit sector runs and works. And I really hope to be part of a movement to start changing that, and creating just systems that really push back against the idea of urgency and perfectionism, and performance and productivity.
Thank you. I appreciate your time, your presence here, and taking this time to chat with you. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
We really hope you all enjoyed this conversation with Sachi Mutashi from the New Mexico Asian Family Center. I just found this conversation so compelling. I'm always really, really interested in, how people reflect on some of these truths in our communities that they don't often see. The experiences from people in our communities that don't often get the same kinds of spotlight, they don't often get the same kind of media coverage. And yet it's extremely important for us as community-minded people who are really interested in reaching out and helping and just being good members of the community to listen to these stories, to kind of bear witness to what's happening in communities that don't get the kind of coverage that is more traditional here in New Mexico. Natsapan, I wonder, how you can reflect on some of the interesting parts of the conversation that that interested you the most.
Yeah, some of the underlying threads of what led to the shift in focus is really the organization's dedication to just simply listening to their communities. I think that by listening and actively listening to community needs, it leads the organization to shift and strategize their focus. And I hope the listeners truly picked up on that. Again, it's shifting their approaches to providing resources and information, make sure that basic needs were met. And also, it was insightful for me to dig a little deeper in terms of what the Asian American Pacific Islander experiences are here in New Mexico, because oftentimes it should be heard more. And I'm happy that the Tilt podcast is, like I said in my interviews, a digital megaphone to hopefully share some of these experiences with our listeners. And lastly, really, I was happy that Sachi had shared with us some grassroots actions of what people can do in response to that.
Tony, I wonder what some of your reflections on the conversation with Sachi as well. There's so much to be learned and gleaned from these experiences and communities here in New Mexico that we might not have as much information about or as much exposure to.
Yeah, I got a real deep education, on the Asian experience in New Mexico in particular, which, is a community that doesn't get a lot of attention here, and I think is often further marginalized by this tricultural myth that we're all kind of living in, of there being, only or predominantly Hispanic and Indigenous and European settlers here. And so I thought that it was incredible when she mentioned that there are hundreds of different Asian languages that are spoke in New Mexico, and that, a big part of the services that they provide are being able to have not only culturally informed, but services, but having to just be able to communicate in such a great variety of languages is an incredible thing that I don't think a lot of people think about as far as accessibility is concerned. And I really also was struck by the way in which her organization, really cultivates such deep community to the point where a lot of their liaisons and employees were former individuals who had received services through the center, and now are acting as bridges to communities to further provide services and connect folks and educate them. So I thought that was like a really beautiful testament to the deep work that they do with Asian communities in New Mexico.
I had no idea that they put together the language access bill.
Yeah.
And it's an alignment of what they advocate for, which is language access.
It was really heartening for me too. I really love that that's one of the ways that folks can kind of take up some advocacy for the Asian American Pacific Islander community in New Mexico. And I kind of connect that with something Sachi was saying about the solidarity efforts between other people of color communities here in New Mexico, with the True New Mexico project that they've embarked on. They're bringing in other voices of people of color, including the Black and Indigenous communities here. And it's so funny because this last kind of year and a half, right, of this so-called racial reckoning that we've had in the United States, if you can call it that, a lot of people have started asking, what more can I do? Not everyone felt comfortable going to a protest, for instance, or, waving signs or standing on the corner and trying to rally support for these various anti-racist efforts. But this is one of those things that's so accessible, right? I mean, going to the protest is great, but you can also advocate for pieces of legislation, such as the language access bill that New Mexico Asian Family Center was really advocating for. And, you know, of course, we heard some of the same things with the Black Lives Matter movement too. You know, write to your local representatives and say, hey, what are you doing to increase social services? What are you doing to address the militarization of the police? It's not just showing up at the protest, right? Like, you can advocate for legislation, you can support local organizations, and many other ways to be involved.
Hello, my name is Reyes Tavor. I am from the Pueblo of Jemez. I currently serve as the Community Programming Director with Pueblo Action Alliance. Some of the programs and projects that I do lead there is the Indigenous Impact Community Care Initiative, which is our mutual aid work with our partners Seeding Sovereignty. And then I also help to co-lead with our youth organizers, the Cultivating Roots and Resistance Youth Internship. There are a lot of things that fall in between there, making sure that everything that we do within our work remains, intergenerational and accessible to our communities and our people. And thank you for inviting me here today.
Did you find that you were working in new ways to provide space for listening and during that outreach to communities to understand what the needs are and how you can meet them? I mean, just because this time of isolation and, kind of moving towards doing everything digitally online, that only works for certain segments of the community and isn't necessarily accessible to everyone. And so I'm just wondering, first of all, how you navigated that, and second of all, if there were any new strategies that you developed to connect and conduct this outreach and listen to communities to understand what their needs were.
I think one of the ways that we had to strategize to keep everyone safe while doing the outreach was making sure that we created like safety protocol contracts, with the volunteers that came, with our teams from PAA and Seeding Sovereignty. We made sure that everybody signed a contract, everybody was also getting regularly tested, and that goes along the lines of the logistics, the practices, because one, we needed to make sure that we were safe because, we didn't want to have any positive cases within our crew. But because of that, we were doing mutual aid. So if we were going to be sharing these resources and providing care and donations to our communities, we needed to make sure that we were in the clear. There were people who weren't living within their tribal communities. We made sure to also provide community mass giveaways in urban areas. So we held one here in Tiwa Territory, and then we held one in Tewa Territory, which is so-called Santa Fe. And, we went out there to them, but we also reached out to Tewa Women United and Three Sisters Collective and asked, like, is this a need? Like, we have lots of masks. Would this help your community? Instead of saying, hey, we want to throw this mask giveaway. Can you guys help us? And I jokingly say that, but honestly, that's what happens a lot of the time, so really being intentional and being respectful of the territories that you're in and how you show up and if you're trying to organize within those spaces also.
That's a really great point to make, because I think it is possible to maybe step on someone's toes, when they've already been so deeply invested in working with a particular community, and so how do you thoughtfully join forces with them to amplify and support the work that they're doing, right, in the way that they've identified is most helpful for the community that they're working in. That's great. Thank you for talking through some of that experience. I guess I'm just curious, like, I know that you had an amazing squad of mostly women, it seems like, who were sewing masks at the beginning. But I know that you also worked to put together food and drinks and, backpacks and care packages for unsheltered relatives. Did you go through any like targeted fundraising campaigns for that? Or how did you raise the money for that so quickly?
At that time, we were also seeing that essentially across the board of organizing, it was already shifting to how can we support our people? How can we support our communities during this time? Because obviously, the federal government wasn't doing anything to provide any kind of care. There was a lot of people within the communities who were experiencing financial instability and just access to food. There was a lot that happened in the very beginning. And what I think was beginning to happen was that like funders or organizations who are in the community who maybe had those funds already were shifting to figure out how can we get this money out to the people whom are on the ground, or mutual aid funds were just kind of put out there a lot. And so we figured mutual aid work at this time is a very vital need, and let's reach out and get those resources to us, so that way we can continue to help our Pueblo and Apache and Dene relatives like within this base. And that's what it was at the beginning, but then later on it expanded even more. But also we appreciated that we put the call out for donations. We put the call out for donations, not just monetarily, but like handing in donations. So Thursdays were still today, to this day, Thursdays, remain the day dedicated to mutual aid work. Those are the days we would go into the office, create care packages. Those are the days when we would tell people they could come and drop off items for us, for the community. And so again, essentially it went back to collective community care. It wasn't just us, and that's what we said in our recent like 1 year anniversary sharing of our work over the year. So we acknowledged that yes, it was PA and Seeding Sovereignty, in this initiative as partners, but it included many hands and many organizations that contributed to it. And so we hope, and that remains at that level of, thinking and that mindset. What I had stated too in our 1 year anniversary presentation is we saw a lot of memes that said we should not go back to normal. And I meant that because one, again, normal wasn't working for us, and never has been. The whole entire US system has never worked for us. It wasn't created for us to thrive in, And so again, we are just in this very pivotal moment to think about how can we really show up for our communities and really create our spaces for us.
That brings me back to something that you had said earlier, that it felt like you're sort of putting a Band-Aid on things, really drilling down into what are the practices of solidarity and care and not charity, right? And so to me, that denotes a sense of sustainability, like of real transformation and change. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, like, now 15 months on from the start of the pandemic, like how are things feeling in Pueblo communities and the communities that you've been working with? First of all, I know that the impacts on Indigenous communities across the US were a lot harsher than they were for other communities. And do things feel like they're stabilizing, or do the needs still feel as urgent now as they were 15 months ago? And sort of what kind of parts of the structure and the community collaborative care system that you've put together feel sustainable that you can carry forward? Like, are the donations still coming in at the same level, or are they dropping off? Just, I guess, a report back on how things are looking now.
When I think about the Pueblo communities, I can tell you that majority of them still remain on lockdown. They still remain on lockdown because, again, as you said, we've been disproportionately impacted. According to New Mexico in depth, 60% of the cases of like COVID cases were represented by Indigenous people when we only make up 11% of the population. And, those numbers are probably skewed because of tribal enrollment and, the issues within blood quantum. That's a whole nother conversation. But, with that being said, mutual aid and collective care and community defense should remain something that should be sustainable. And I think for PAA, we are in this time right now where we're really, taking a look back, okay, reassessing our needs, reassessing and looking at, okay, how are we going to continue to help in providing collective care? We're looking at the tribes, and right now with the tribes, a lot of them are within stages of getting everybody vaccinated right now. So we necessarily haven't really been providing care donations to tribal communities right now because we know that they're focused on that. But remaining donations that we've been reaching out to different organizations. Providing care to unsheltered relatives is definitely going to be something that will always be ongoing for us, we believe, as that should be. We're in this space of let's figure out what can actually be fruitful in a good way that is going to provide, not just care, but for us to, be healthy and thrive, and to be able to know that we have a community and that our community members can trust us, not just as an organization, but as like community members, as relatives, that we're gonna show up and we're gonna be there when we can.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, are the various aspects of like a integrated approach to wellness. And I know, my familiarity with Pueblo Action Alliance is first within the environmental justice movement, and water rights in particular, and extractive industries are really big here in New Mexico, and again, disproportionately affect Indigenous communities. And the land back movement, but now seeing all of the work that you are doing for community care and these defense systems, it makes sense that it's all related to a holistic approach to wellness. It really seems like it's a big foundation of what Pueblo Action Alliance is doing.
Wellness is actually one of the things that I promote a lot. My background is in early childhood education. And so before doing Pueblo Action Alliance work, I was invested in families and children, and, just being within the homes, and because I was a home visitor. So I was providing parent education on child development. So I was in the home with lots of low income families, and I just, being there and experiencing that, it's just completely important that, the social emotional development of a family of children is extremely important to wellness. Being able to understand your emotions and then to be able to communicate them, that's a part of wellness. And the reason why I share that too, because if we were able to have that structure early on and to be provided that knowledge, then it's a preventative measure for healthier wellness, for us to like thrive with not just within our families, but within our communities. What's really hard is, we have so much intergenerational trauma within our communities. And I don't want to, just dampen our conversation with that. But those are a lot of the things that we have to face, not just within our communities, but even within our own families, within each other as organizers. It can be very challenging some days, but it's also why it's important to provide spaces of wellness, so that way we can actively be able to show up. This year we got to host our 5th annual healing circle. Fortunately, it had to be the second year that was virtual, but it was still a space that we were able to provide to the community. And I think it was extremely beneficial because of the conversations that were had within those spaces, to be able to vent and to share and to have that safe space of knowing, like, hey, we've had a rough year, but we're still going to keep pushing forward, and we're going to make sure that we're doing that in a way that is going to keep us going for 7 generations ahead. That's why it's important, again, for community defense, for wellness, for land back, for water back. All of those things are all interconnected, and you can't have one without the other. We've also been considering, about the transition coming out of the pandemic. We're not definitely expecting things to go back to normal, but thinking about how we want to integrate back into the community. How are we going to make sure that we can continue to provide those safe spaces, because we also know that not everybody is super comfortable in gathering just yet. So how can we create that, because it can't just skip over and we're all in person again. It has to be slowly done. It has to be in a way that we're making sure that our community members feel safe and comfortable in the ways that will provide further community events and other ways to do outreach with them. So Julia Bernal, our Alliance Director, has really been having us think about, well, what does our activism look like outside of social media too? And so that's also why I'm expanding on, we're thinking about that transition, and this is also, again, why ceremonial action is important, because it would be contradictory if we're just showing our faces and ourselves just on social media or at rallies or different things, and not to disrespect those other approaches that are accessible for certain people, because activism does look different for everybody. But for Pueblo peoples and for us as an organization, that's what it looks like for us.
What is a point of learning, perhaps, that you would like to direct folks' attention to that you think is important from a Pueblo perspective?
Important from a Pueblo perspective, and I think Indigenous perspective as well during this time of the pandemic, is to note that individualistic mindsets aren't going to get us anywhere. The reason why the cases were so high and it became a global pandemic was because of individualistic thinking. In addition to federal government not giving us the protection and the care that we should have been given. But when you have people out there who were only thinking of themselves, through the pandemic. Um, it was hard. It was hard to see because as Pueblo people, we couldn't go back to our land. I couldn't access Hemus for a very long time. And that hurt just to not be able to go home when I wanted to. Basically, what I would like people to know is that we've lost a lot of elders. We've lost people who speak our language. We haven't been able to participate in our ceremonial life ways. Like, our lives were completely altered. Not to say that other cultures weren't, but there was a shift, within not just our communities, but the society and the greater society. And we need to continuously remember that, to show up for each other in a good way, and remember that collective community care is going to be what's going to carry us through, with many other ways to show up.
Powerful interview between Tony and Reyes Tavore from the Pueblo Action Alliance. There's so much to reflect on here. Tony, just give us some of your initial thoughts and feelings, and what really stood out for you during this wonderful conversation.
I think one of the most impactful parts of my conversation with Reyes was understanding how difficult having lack of access to ancestral homelands was for her, and I'm sure many other Indigenous peoples, and Pueblo peoples in particular here in New Mexico, during the lockdowns. Obviously the tribes were protecting themselves as they needed to from having influx of visitors and bringing the virus with them. But, just understanding how deeply integrated the connection to land and community is to everyday life, as well as ritual and ceremony. And so I thought that it was really beautiful that Reyes described how Pueblo Action Alliance grounded their work in digital ceremonial actions, as a way to help the community still find those kinds of connections in the ways that were accessible to them during the lockdowns, even if they couldn't get to their ancestral lands directly.
That's a pun. I wonder about your reflections as well, especially because there's so many similarities between this idea that sometimes we think we know what's going on in communities. Sometimes we think we have information, or we think we're informed, but there's so many of these hidden experiences that quite often most other parts of our communities don't have access to. And there's so much more to consider. I wonder what your reflections on the conversation were.
Well, I can only help but to compare it to New Mexico Asian Family Center. I mean, the initiatives that Pueblo Action Alliance are undertaking are really centered around their community, and that mirrors the conversation I had with Sachi. And at the heart of that, it's really about um, addressing the needs back again. In terms of Pueblo Action Alliance, you've heard from Ray's about their mutual aid initiative, their community defense initiative, to making sure that people are cared for. And also an overlap it's about within the organization themselves, the staff and the people who are working, whether it's at Pueblo Action Alliance or at New Mexico Asian Family Center, it's making sure that the staff members are well cared for. And what does that mean? It's about restructuring the existing structure pre-COVID. And how will that change during COVID, to making sure that their staff are cared for. I think in terms of Pueblo Action Alliance, it's about interacting and having an agreement.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting to meditate a little bit on the similarities, of the two organizations and the way that they center care in a really sort of holistic way that is more complicated and in depth than just say, this is care for a person, or this is care for a body. There's culture integrated into it, there's language integrated into it, there's community integrated into it, there's the more than human aspect of life integrated into it, whether it's the land or the water, and the other beings that the land and water we share with, and that both organizations, as an important aspect of caring not only for their communities that they serve, but their staff as well, because they are part of the communities that they serve.
Thank you to all of our listeners out there, and a special thanks to today's guests, Sachi Watasi and Reyes Devore. Check out our Podbean page for more information about the New Mexico Asian Family Center and the Pueblo Action Alliance. You can also subscribe to the Tilt Podcast on our Podbean page. That's sfai.podbean.com. New episodes drop on the fourth Friday of every month. Our next episode, titled Putting Down Roots, will be out July 23rd. To find out more about SFAI and stay informed about our upcoming programming, visit sfai.org and sign up for our monthly newsletter. On our support page, you can find some great SFAI merchandise, t-shirts, water bottles, limited edition artwork, and more. Learn about our Pivot membership, or you can make a quick and easy tax-deductible donation of any amount. 73 cents of every dollar you contribute goes to support our socially engaged, underrepresented, and marginalized artists and creative practitioners from across the globe. Check out our incredible 2021 labor residents on our website. That's sfai.org. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Just search at Santa Fe Art Institute.